Afternoon. I guess I have to say good morning. We do have quite a lot of people online, over 30 people online, and I guess the most here in North America. So good afternoon, everyone. So we're getting this event started. So today we have this event featuring Professor Daniel Bell's book. You can see in the background some information about the book. And also I have some good news for you is I got a discount code from the publisher. Um, you might see that bottom. If you want to buy the book, yeah, you can see that code. That's BEL 30. You can get 30% discounts. That's pretty good. So you have to go to the Princeton University Press website, and you can order there using this discount code, and you can get that good price. All right. So now, just before I'm going to introduce the speaker and also the discussants, I need to acknowledge the land. So this is event hosted by York University. So I will acknowledge the land from York University. So let me start that. Then I will introduce the speakers and the discussants. York University recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University's campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Lakalanto has been caretaken by Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with one bone belt covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. Okay, now I'm going to introduce the speaker today. We have the honor to have Professor Daniel Bell traveling all the way from Hong Kong today with us to talk about his book. Daniel is originally from Montreal, Quebec. So he's a Canadian. And he was educated at McGill University and Oxford University. He's currently the chair of the political theory at University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law. And previously, Bell served as the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at the Shandong University Qingdao campus. To my knowledge, he's the first foreigner, Westerner, holding such a position of this kind at a major Chinese university. So he holds such a position from 2017 to 2022. Yeah, so he just left that position, joined Hong Kong University early this year. He published a lot. Let me just mention a few of his books that include The Dean of Shandong. That's the book he's going to focus on today. And you will see that. You will listen to him. And also the Just Hierarchy. That's a book co-authored with his wife, Wang Pei, Dr. Wang Pei. And the China Model. Another book is The Spirit of the Cities. And another book, China's New Confucianism. Another book, Beyond Liberal Democracy. And another book, East Meets West. So you can see it's really productive. Published so many books. Another thing I need to mention is he published all the books for the Princeton University Press. That fact shows the quality of his books and his research. He's also the founding editor of the Princeton-China series. That series also hosted by the Princeton University Press, which translates and publishes the original and influential academic works from China. So that's the speaker for today, Professor Daniel Bell. We also have two discussants, very senior scholars, joining us as discussants. This is also a privilege for us. So I'll introduce the two discussants in the alphabetic order. The first is Professor Bernie Froelich, my colleague at York. Bernie is the Professor Emeritus Politics at York University. He first visited China in 1965. And imagine that, how long ago. He served as the first secretary at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing in the 1970s. He's the author, co-author, editor of 6 books on China and Canada-China relations, including his most recent book on Canadian relations to China since the 1970s. He's currently the director of the York University Asian Business and Management Program, which has trained over 8,000 party and government officials, educators, and professionals from China since 2000. Our second discussant, Bruce Hegel, is a professor at Ontario Institute of Studies of Education, which is part of the University of Toronto. And she served as the education counselor at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing from 1989 to 1991. So that was a quite unique time period. And also the director of the Hong Kong Institute of Education, which is now the Educational University of Hong Kong. She served as director from 1997 to 2002. She's still holding the President Emeritus in the Hong Kong Education University. So those are the introductions I need to make. And now I'm going to give the floor to Daniel.
So thank you, Professor Zhao, for the wonderful introduction. And it is this much as, you know what, it is a real honor to be here and to have such distinguished commentators. And I feel humbled, really. And I look forward to the discussion more than anything. And I also see people, I see my cousin, younger cousin, and I see my colleague. So it's a special, of course, new friends as well. So I look forward to this talk. So I'm from Montreal, as Professor Zhao just mentioned. I'm happy also to be back in a relatively harmonious country, notwithstanding these dark times. I know lots of talks here, but compared to the rest of the world, I'm still pretty lucky to be here. The things that worry us, like for example, last night, Montreal Canadiens losing to Toronto Police, which does make me sad. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not the end of the world. Okay.
Can't hear me? Okay. Oh, is it like this is okay? Here? Okay. Yeah, so I just thank people, and then when I refer to my cousin, she's actually on Zoom, so let me say I see you, and I'm happy that you're here. So this, I don't want to talk too long. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make 3 points. I mean, one of the things that I learned as a kind of university administrator, when we give speeches, we typically, regardless of the content, we give 3 points, because if it's 1 or 2 points, it's like too superficial. 4 is unlucky number in Chinese. And once you make 5 or 6 points, it's too many, and you start losing the audience, so to speak. But you can embed sub-points in these 3 points. I'm going to embed 3 points in each, 3 sub-points in each of these 3 points. So I'm going to say first a little bit why I wrote this book, and then I'll say why I served as dean, and then I'll say a bit about what I learned as dean. So the first point why I wrote this book, I don't know if any of you listen to this New Books Network podcast. It's my favorite podcast. It's about new books in academia. And I listened to it a lot, especially when I was in China, when it was actually hard, it's getting harder to buy English language books. But this is, you get top of the line podcasts on new books. And they always ask the first question, why did you write this book? So I'm going to begin with this question. And the first is that, perhaps not surprisingly, is that through my experience serving as dean, I learned a lot. And I think there's a lot that sheds light on Chinese academia and the Chinese political system. But it's not, I confess, I mean, compared to to Bernie's book, which took 10 years to write and is very systematic, interviewed so many people. Mine is a bit more kind of lighthearted, and the kind of fancy term is philosophical anthropology, but it's really just storytelling. But I tell stories that are meant to shed light on Chinese academia and the political system. And as mentioned, I mean, of course, I'm from Montreal, it's a foreign background, but I've been living in China for over 3 decades. But yeah, I still have a little bit of a kind of outsider perspective. And this is quite fascinating that I was given this opportunity to serve as dean, because Shandong University is the largest university, or the most important university, I can say, in a province of 100 million people. So just imagine. And I don't know if any of you are from Beida or Tsinghua, you might not be happy to hear this, but it's actually harder if you're from Shandong to get into Shandong University than you're from Beijing or to get into Beida or Tsinghua, just because there's a kind of reverse affirmative action. If you're from the big cities, it's easier to get into the universities in those cities. So Shandong University is a great university in a huge province. So we have it's super competitive to get in, and we have excellent students. And before I came, the university was based in Jinan, which is the capital of Shandong province, and we wanted to open a new campus in Qingdao. It's actually an hour from Qingdao. And when I first heard about that about 15 years ago, I was brought there by, his name is Kong Shuji. He's a 76th generation descendant of Confucius. And he said, we're going to open a new campus here. And the first time he brought me out, he just showed me a cornfield. And I said, really, that's fascinating. Sure enough, 5 years later, the university was built, beautiful buildings, beautiful new campus right on the sea. And he said, and he offered me the chance to serve as dean. And it's a big faculty, 1,000 students, about 80 professors now. And it was a great honor. So that's one reason why, so that's the first reason I wrote the book, is that quite a few interesting accounts or stories based on my experience. But I must confess, I wasn't so successful as dean. I'm going to explain a little bit why. In fact, but I think there's a lot to learn from failure as much as from success. So that's one reason why I wrote this book too, telling stories that went wrong and misunderstandings. It's also a way of generating interesting knowledge. But I do want to thank my colleagues and fellow leaders at Shandong University, especially my faculty. They have such a hardworking ethic. And so partly I wrote this book as a way to, since I wasn't so successful as dean, but maybe this book could provide some sort of lasting, let's say, I don't want to say legacy, but a lasting account of the positive things that went on at Shandong University, even though I wasn't directly responsible for much of the good part. A third reason, and this I do confess is a very political motive, and is that I worry very much about the demonization of China in the Western media, in public statements by political leaders, and in the views held by citizens in most Western countries. So I thought, well, how can I counter that? I mean, frankly, when I read this now, I say, what was going through my mind? How can I think that writing this little book can counter the larger forces that contribute to the demonization of China? It seems so pompous, but anyway, that's what I tried to do. And the approach that I use that I thought might be somewhat different is that I used a kind of humorous and lighthearted approach, because there's so much about China that's deadly serious, right? And the subject material here is deadly serious, right? Bureaucracy, Confucianism, censorship, communism. But I wrote a kind of lighthearted way. And this cover kind of shows a little bit about the approach. So it's not designed by me. It's designed by a graphic designer, artist at Princeton University Press. And each emoji more or less represents one of the themes. And it expresses this kind of lighthearted and humorous approach. I should say a little bit, my father, he was a writer. His name was Don Bell. He passed away many years ago. And at the end of his life, he became a bookseller, secondhand bookseller. So he was quite a well-known writer. One of his books was called Saturday Night at the Bagel Factory. It won the Stephen Leacock Award for Humor in 1971. But at the end of his life, he didn't have energy to write anymore, and he became a secondhand bookseller. And one of his final words to me was, he says, at the end of the day, you have to judge a book by its cover. And on those grounds alone, this is a great book. And it's not taking any credit because I'm not responsible for the cover, but it really is a beautiful cover that reflects the theme. Anyway, so I tried to use this kind of lighthearted and humorous approach to counter this demonization. And partly, just on using this lighthearted and humorous approach, I think that was kind of successful because many of the reviews, even the really harsh ones, like there's one review by Gordon Chang, he's like the Uber hawk, he wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China about 20 years ago. Of course, we're still waiting. But even in his review, he said, of course, I don't understand China, thank you. But then he says, it's entertaining. Okay, fine. So much of the positive reviews actually have come from the center right, like it was excerpted in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times said it's one of the best summer books of the year. I find that the center right is a little bit more open-minded to controversial views than the kind of liberal consensus in the Western media anyway, which is so hard to change and so confident and kind of self-righteous. Anyway, I'm not going to pursue this polemical stuff anymore. But so I want to position myself a little bit in the middle. I know it's common to say I'm in the middle of two extremes, but on the other hand, in China, this book is kind of, because I raise many politically sensitive issues. So all of my previous books have been translated in Chinese. This one in the mainland China has yet to be approved, but there is a beautiful translation coming out in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, lots of things wrong in Hong Kong, but in terms of academic freedom, especially if you work on mainland Chinese politics, it's much more free than in mainland China. But perhaps even more surprising, the English language version was also banned initially. But Princeton University Press has an office in Beijing, and I'm totally favor engagement. More engagement, the better. They pushed, and finally it was approved, but with an official stamp, because I was Dean of Political Science, right? So kind of, I'm supposed to be a public official, but this official stamp, it's for all the copies sold in mainland China, has its official stamp. It's basically an official stamp saying that the book is not officially endorsed. And the official department that wrote this stamp is an unnamed. So it's kind of distinctly, an interesting solution. I gave a talk in the US, and one of the professors was an expert on censorship in the Renaissance Italy. And he said, if only the Vatican had thought of this great solution. You allow books, but you put a stamp like that way you don't have to take any responsibility if things go wrong. You might want to look at it. Those of you who read Chinese, it's kind of interesting. It's a little stamp here. Yeah, and there's even one. So all the books in mainland China have this stamp. And also on page 153, one of the lines has been blotted out with what we used to call liquid paper. Other than that, though, it's all available. But all the copies in mainland China have this stamp. So I'm I wanted to position myself as a kind of, I don't know, it might sound popular. It's like a compassionate, criticism. I do love, and I feel at home in China, frankly, especially in Shandong province. But of course, I have a critical view as well. So that's kind of where I position myself. But that said, again, the idea that I could change, views, I just think now is just hopeless. Like you just read a headline in New York Times, like, I think it was something recently, like Chinese citizens to encourage to spy on each other. I mean, that sort of headline does 100 times more, not 100, like 1,000,000 times more damage than anything I could write in my book. The forces let's call it demonization, are just so strong. Just as a rule of thumb, I do think it's a good idea to just read sorry, it's going to sound polemical, the leading Western media outlets, and just assume that the opposite is true, and just play that game. And at least half the time, thinking the opposite is true is more likely to be true than thinking that what is said there is true. Anyway, what can change the relations? I just spent 2 weeks giving talks in the US, and my humble conclusion is that things can change so long as China is like number 2 and putting pressure on number 1. But if the relations of power change in the next 20 or 30 years, like if for example, if China becomes number 1, the most superior economic power, maybe even the most superior military power, then the US is going to give up trying to contain China. And and we'll try to work with China to solve global challenges like climate change and, regulation of nuclear weapons and dealing with pandemics and so on. It's just so obvious. But until the relations of power change, that's not going to happen. Of course, another possibility is that China drops to like number 3, and let's say India becomes number 2. In that case, India will be the new victim of demonization, and maybe at that point too, China will become the U.S.-China relations will improve. Of course, I'm not hoping for that, but I'm just saying that's what might. What might happen. Okay, so let me move on to the second point: why I served as dean, because it's not obvious. I mean, I like to read and write books, and that's what I did for most of my adult life. And some of my friends in the West, they said, "Are you sure?" Even like the ones who work in China, if they're from the West, they say, "Are you sure you want to be dean?" Like I remember once I was at a friend's home in Stanford, and then he received a phone call, and then he jumped in joy. And I said, "What happened? What happened?" He says, "I do not have to serve as head of department." He was so happy, But I think in China, especially in Shandong province, which I think is the most bureaucratic part of the most bureaucratic country of the world, there's a great honor and desire to serve as a public official. Of course, it has a kind of Confucian heritage as well. And just to give you one example, in the rest of China, the lucky number is 8, right? Because it sounds like wealth. But Shandong, as far as I know, is the only province where the lucky number is 7, because, it's Xi Shang Ba Xia. So we know the saying, but basically when you're 57 years old, if you're still a public official, you have the hope of being promoted. But if you're 58, it means you're on the way to retirement. So on the license plates in Shandong, you'd have more 7s and fewer 8s. And it would be lucky to have an office with the number 7, People love to strive to be public officials, but as I heard from some of my friends, Shandong also takes a bit of pride in we never had an emperor, or including or a leader in post 1949 China, because it's assumed that the Confucian ethos of serving the public, it works pretty well at the mid-level bureaucracy, but once you get to the top, politics becomes more dirty and more kind of, more legalist. So Shandong, it's interesting. Strong desire to serve as a public official, but not quite at the very top. But of course, it's more than that. Like in Chinese, like the word yuan, it sounds like beautiful almost. And whereas if you're in English and you say dean, okay, it's among academics, maybe that sounds good. But if you go like to, if I tell like people in Montreal, my friends who are not in the academic world, I said, okay, very interesting. What time does the hockey game start, right? I mean, but in China, it's different. Like, even if I go to the market, of course, I wouldn't say, but somebody next to me might say, and then they become very respectful, serve vegetables and so on. I mean, there's really something about, I guess we can say that it's a kind of vanity reason for wanting to serve as dean in China. And my Chinese friends, go for it. It's such a good opportunity for you. And I had written a book called The China Model, which is widely misinterpreted as a defense of the status quo. It's a defense of an ideal called political meritocracy, in Chinese, 贤能政治. And basically it's the idea that the political system should aim to select and promote public officials with above average ability and virtue. And I had the idea to write this book when I was working at Tsinghua for 13 years, because most of my colleagues, they didn't argue about, when could we have one person, one vote? It's about how can we train leaders who have above average ability and virtue. And I thought, wow, what a great idea to write a book on that theme, which I did. But it was still a kind of ideal. And then when I was given the chance to learn about the bureaucracy from the inside, then it was a very good opportunity to be given that opportunity. And just to mix up the points a little bit, one thing that I did learn as dean, and this is really I only got this from experience. When I just was writing this book based on theory and reading and so on, my earlier book, I had a chapter on what are the key qualities of public officials. And I said there were 3. One is above average analytical ability at higher levels of government, because the issues are so complex, right? You need to have, you need to know economics, you need to know environmental science, you need to know international relations, you need to know human psychology work, you need history, you need philosophy. You want somebody at higher levels of government who's really smart. But you also need high EQ, because one thing that I learned is, I knew this before, but as dean, what did I do most of the time? Kai hui. When you're in meetings all the time, you have to spend most of your time in meetings, like at Shandong, we had even longer meetings, I'm told, than other universities, like often would last 4 hours. And you have to spend your time trying to persuade others from different perspectives. And you need high EQ to do that, understand who's saying what and why they're saying that, and to try to persuade them. If you're a professor and you just read books, you don't need to have, especially once you have tenure. Maybe before tenure, you need high EQ. But once you have tenure, you can just have, it doesn't matter if you're good at engaging with people. But if you're in a public official, you have to have higher than above average EQ. And you also need higher than above average of virtue. Here, I don't mean to say that you need to be like a shaman or a junzi. You just need to be at least partly willing to serve the community and serve other people, as opposed to being completely corrupt, selfish, only care about your own, your family interests. You have to be at least partly willing to serve other people. And if you're a successful dean, you have to think of other people's needs and interests and try to satisfy their needs and interests. And it helps, of course, if you're motivated to do so. But one thing I didn't know, and I didn't mention in this book, I only got this from serving as dean. You have to have a tremendous work ethic. You have to have stamina. I mean, especially, I don't know if it's like through this WeChat, Weixin, I was on call all the time, including weekends. There's no break. And if I don't respond within like 10 or 15 minutes, people are going to start phoning and panicking, It's really, you have to have tremendous work ethic and be on call and be willing to work so hard. That's another reason why I admire the leaders. I just didn't have that same level of stamina that my other fellow leaders had. And then I started looking at Chinese history and some of the great public officials in the past. Turns out that was also really the ones who were successful. It's whether it's used for good or bad purposes we can argue about, but undeniably you need to have a super strong work ethic, hard, stamina that's way above the charts. Only then can you be successful. Like there's one called Chen Hong from the Qing Dynasty, a great book on him, and over it comes up. Maybe he wasn't that original thinker, but my God, did he work hard, And still now today, to be a good public official, you have to have this ability to work hard. So if I were to rewrite the China model, I would add that as a fourth trait. Perhaps most important of all, if you have all the other three traits, but you don't have this stamina, you're not going to succeed. And arguably, that's one reason why I didn't succeed as well as I had hoped. So, but the second reason I took the job as service is because it was a good opportunity to promote Confucianism. Shandong province is the home ground of Confucianism. And again, Kong Shuji, he's a descendant of Hongzi, and 7th generation. And yes, he liked the fact that I had worked on Confucianism in the past, and I could help to promote Confucianism at our new university. But one thing I learned pretty fast is that, and I tried in the beginning to change the educational curriculum, that's so hard to do. And then I learned not to push too hard. But what you can do is hire good teachers. It's hard to teach not just Confucianism, but any political tradition in an engaging way. And one way to do it well is to have teachers who understand the tradition well and who could engage with it with other traditions in a kind of argumentative format, the Confucian and legalist debates or the Confucian and Mozi, and of course, Confucianism in comparison with Western traditions. And so that, to the extent that I had a little bit of success, it was more in hiring other teachers who could promote Confucianism in an interesting way. I mean, I did one course on Xunzi, which I thought worked pretty well. Again, I'm supposed to be humble, but this was a seminar with like 12 students, and we did it in Chinese. And all of my students who took it, they had done the Gaokao, where you have to memorize the chapter 1 of Xunzi. So we didn't spend much time on the content, but it was a question of, how do I encourage debate? So what I did is I asked the students to submit 6 questions based on each 3-hour seminar. We'd go over like 2 or 3 paragraphs very slowly. And I would say, tell me 2 points that you disagree with and why, 2 points that you agree with and why, and 2 points that you don't understand. And then based on the students' interests, I would try to, play them off against each other. You favor A, you favor minus A. Why? Tell me why. And that would be a good way of doing it too. So some of the other teachers also kind of adopted this approach. The third reason why, is that because Shandong University, along with every university in China that I know, had a strong desire to internationalize, promote good ties send students and teachers abroad, invite teachers and students from outside, and hire students from abroad. That's so important to learn from the best practices, of course, and also to promote. There's a very strict academic meritocracy. It also helps to promote the university's rankings in the kind of academic meritocracy. And so that I spent most of my first 2 years trying to establish ties with universities abroad and other ways to internationalize university. That's one reason why I don't like demonization, by the way, is that all it does is it strengthens the kind of repressive paranoid forces in the Chinese government. But every academic that I know favors engagement. You know, they're the victims of this as well. If we in the West have a more open approach to Chinese academia, especially, I mean, this is win-win. You know, almost all academics that I know want to engage, not just with the West, but with the rest of the world. And it's so, so I had a little bit of success with that, but of course then COVID hit and it all came to a sudden grinding halt. So that's one reason why at the end of my term, the last chapter in here is on in defense of symbolic leadership. I became a symbolic leader, or my wife said that I was like the faculty panda. I mean, whatever way we put it, because I didn't have that much to do, nothing to do with the internationalize, except one or two of our professors were stuck abroad, trying to bring them back. Yeah, so that's one reason why I didn't succeed as well. So what did I learn? Well, I learned many things about how mid-level bureaucracy works. I've already mentioned this capacity for hard work. I learned too about the importance of collective leadership, which I didn't know. I mean, I was kind of told that, you know, when you start with as a dean, it's like, you know, in Chinese, yuanzhang, full of swan. You know, the dean kind of decides and then people follow. I learned, like, the first day I attended a meeting in Jinan. It was a 4-hour meeting where each leader, we had, you know, 4 vice deans, 3 party secretaries. Each one does a work report, like 20 minutes, and then you would deliberate about that. And then at the end, and this was a time when we were moving the whole faculty from Jinan to Qingdao. And I was new, and we were arguing about issues like which chairs should we take, and which, you know, and I said, okay, now, please tell us what to do. I have no idea what to do. And then I realized that you need a lot of local knowledge, and you need tremendous amount of, you know, deliberative capacity in this collective leadership before anything could be done. Collective leadership is a great system for avoiding bad decisions. Like, I had lots of bad ideas before I came in. They were shot down pretty quickly. Like, one of them, I wanted to have a phone-free day on the whole campus because I didn't like cell calls. I realized that's not going to work, you know. So collective leadership is so important. Maybe even more so in Shandong and other parts of China. I draw implications for the higher, a bit speculative about higher levels of government. Because one thing about collective leadership is that it was very open. We were very critical of each other. But once to make a decision, then that's the consensus, right? That nobody outside knows. And when we had meetings with the faculty, we, you know, more or less, it was the leaders would you know, say what we decided, and then I don't think we ever once faced a question by the professors. So if things like that happen to higher levels of government and there's some form of collective leadership, then I'm still relatively optimistic, or let's say not so pessimistic about China's political future. I also learned a lot about, well, the role of the shuji at mid-levels of the bureaucracy. You know, the party secretary theoretically is there to, like, you know, the Westerners would think, and I had that kind of view as well, to, like, enforce the dominant ideology of the ruling, you know, from the top. But that's like the easiest part of the job. I mean, and that's a minority part of what the party secretary does. A lot of what they do, like in this case, is like building a new campus. But also when things go wrong, that's non-academic, it's the party secretary that deals with it. During COVID, the party secretary is full-time on campus. I mean, and we're always on call. Once we had a tragedy on our campus, and the party secretary had to spend time comforting the bereaved family. So that's why in this book, I say, you know, maybe we should call them like harmony secretaries, because most of what they do, at least in mid-levels of bureaucracy, is dealing with kind of problems of social harmony. And it turns out, I did a bit of reading, that once party secretaries retire, what do they do often? This is not well known. Well, it turns out they have the same skills that therapists need. So some of them, when they retire, they become therapists. It's really interesting. I also have a chapter on drinking alcohol, which is more of a Shandong thing as well. Shandong has the highest per capita alcohol consumption in China. And it's related a little bit to the Confucian heritage, because the analects of Confucius, of course, we should lead a moderate life, but there's one exception: drinking without limits. So there's kind of, when we had meetings, typically the first opening conversation would be "你的酒量好不好?" Like, how is your drinking ability? And why is that? I mean, it's not because drinking would be as a way to establish social bonds and to make people care about each other. But of course, it can go wrong. Some people don't enjoy drinking. But in university settings, it's quite civilized. If you don't like to drink white liquor, then you could put water and just participate of the toast and without feeling any pressure. But outside university, things go wrong much more often. I have of course, a chapter on academic meritocracy, which is very, very strong. There is increased censorship, and the longest chapter in the book is on academic censorship. No doubt about that, and no academic likes it. But there's also very strong emphasis on academic meritocracy, meaning that there's much more emphasis now on publications, including publications in English, which is a bit odd, because on the one hand, there's this kind of increased nationalism in China. On the other hand, professors are rewarded more for publishing in English and Chinese, which penalizes those who work in Chinese. So I spent some time helping younger professors to copy edit and do proofreading. I'm pleased to report about one development since I left, though, which is ChatGPT. Now they do a very good job of taking academic works in Chinese and translating them into English. Of course, you still have to read it, but it's that. So there might be less, difficulty for those who write in Chinese in the future due to the invention of ChatGPT. Another thing that I learned, is about, let me just say a little bit about, one about the return of Confucianism or the Confucian comeback, and two, I want to say something about the communist comeback. I don't know how much time I have been talking now.
35 minutes.
I've already been talking 35 minutes. Oh, yeah. So I go very quickly. So there was a time when it seemed like Confucianism was about to literally replace communism as a kind of guiding value system, including the official level. And at one time, it did seem like, the Chinese Communist Party may be even relabeled the Chinese Confucian Party, but that's pretty much stalled over the past 10 years. I don't think the Confucian comeback has gone down, but it's pretty much has leveled off. And now there's pretty much a view that Confucianism is going to be there to supplement the guiding value system, but not to replace it. And Confucianism is much more strong, I think, in Shandong than other parts of China. So the sociologists who wanted to empirical work on the revival of Confucianism, like Anna Sun, who's at Duke, Sébastien Biou, he's in France, they do much of their work in Shandong province. Like even Shandong Airlines, Shanhong, if any of you have taken it, above every seat there's a saying from the Analects of Confucius. And typically I'm in seat 3A, because I have this gold card, so I'm in the first row of the economy. And they always have the same thing above, a saying from the Analects of Confucius. It's 父母在，不远游. So if your parents are alive, you shouldn't go far, which is, I always get so guilty because my mother's in Montreal. So anyway, that's a kind of sign of how the Confucian ethos is still very, very strongly held in Shandong province. But what has happened, and this caught me by surprise, but it became reinforced when I served as dean, is the Marxist tradition, the communist tradition has made a huge comeback. Not just as a way of an official ideology. And this is huge. Like the 1980s, most of the students and intellectuals that I knew from China really, of course, said, yes, officially we're a communist country, but nobody believes in this stuff anymore. In fact, very few students high-performing students competed to join the ruling organization. Now it's completely the opposite. Very rigorous competition to join the ruling organization. And there is realization that communism is important. First, as a critical way to critically analyze the flaws of capitalism after the 2008 global financial crisis. How did you always say huge funds? How do we make sense of that? Well, Marx and Marxists have a lot to say. So a lot of the academic work on Marxism has come back. And So now there's also strong emphasis on everybody recognizes there's a huge gap between rich and poor in China. We need to deal with that. So again, this kind of egalitarian strand of the communist tradition is also hugely important in helping to justify some of the policies and practices meant to reduce the gap between rich and poor. There's also a view about the future. I mean, the communist ideal is that advanced machinery does a socially necessary labor, and then humans are free to realize their creative talents. So in China, compared to Canada, I'd say people are more optimistic about AI. Like in Canada, I hear a lot about existential threats, but in China, there's much more optimism that maybe in 20 or 30 years, advanced AI will help to do the social necessary work, and then will be free to realize their creative talents. So whatever happens in the future, and nobody knows what will happen except it will be completely different than where we are now. But if you're relatively optimistic, then I think the Confucian ideal that the good life lies in harmonious and compassionate social relations, as well as the communist ideal that the good life lies in realizing one's creative talents, will be important in shaping what people think of as ideas. But of course, there's many other legalist, I write a lot about the Jia tradition, and Taoism, Buddhism, liberalism, feminism. It's all going to be there too. But I think the Confucian and communist traditions will be very much important part of this story. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bell, for sharing so many interesting stories. It reminds me, at the beginning, we were talking about how much time he would spend on his talk. And at that moment, he was hesitant about talking long. And he said 30 minutes. And easily, it went over 40 minutes. That shows how many stories he would have in his stomach, and perhaps a lot more details. So at this point, I would encourage the audience, including the in-person audience and online audience, to prepare your questions and try your best to press more stories from Daniel. So now I'm going to invite two discussants to provide your comments and observations. So Bernie, can you?
That's it. Thank you for inviting me to be a speaker to comment on this fascinating book, and to welcome back to Canada the prodigal son, the Canadian who hasn't been here too often, but we welcome you back. And I promise, forgive me, I may have more than 3 points, but I may not take 40 minutes. And I will read what I've written. Daniel, you have produced an extraordinary book. It cuts across conventional political boundaries, opens new areas of thought and imagination. One can teach a whole course on China using your book. And I've read it twice, and while I question many of your conclusions, we can talk about that, we need to hear what you have to say. And we have. Once in a while, an individual tries to make a difference, challenging existing assumptions, testing the limits of current thinking, being provocative, going into somewhat forbidden areas. You've done this with your advocacy of political meritocracy as the best political system, rejecting Western-style electoral democracy, not just for China, but actually in your book you say it's for the whole world. Advocating the adoption of Confucian principles by the Communist Party of China. You were also the first foreigner, as you said, to be appointed ever Dean of a political science faculty in a major Chinese university. And while serving as dean, you worked closely with party members, perhaps more than almost all other foreigners, and gained respect for their hard work, and you've mentioned that in your talk, and commitment to public service. somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I think some of what you write is tongue-in-cheek, but somewhat tongue-in-cheek, you have predicted the Confucianization of communism within 2 decades in your book. Although then, because of recent events in China and following your 5-year experience as dean, you now say it's going to take much longer. Okay, so you said your ideas are controversial. I agree. That's why you're here. Many Western observers say you are an apologist for a communist regime. And in fact, in this book, you are comfortable with that role. You even say at one point you are prepared to, quote, be a servant of the Chinese state, and that you are willing to submit. Now, maybe we all feel that way about Canada. I don't know. Not the best way to get acceptance of your ideas in the developed West today. That plus your rejection of electoral democracy in favor of rule by a small group, and your forceful criticism of the West have limited the appeal of your ideas outside of China. But what about inside China? You were part of an experiment looking to anchor itself more closely to Chinese tradition and culture. The party asked you, a foreigner, to develop Confucian studies in the university close to Chifu, the very center of Chinese Confucianism. But after 5 years you left, saying, and I'm quoting from the book, I was too naive in thinking that China would move to a more humane political system informed first and foremost by Confucian values and more tolerant for social and political dissent. Recent repressive policies by the Chinese Party state, you chose the term for repressive in your book. Your concerns about collective leadership at the top, you say there are too many yes men at the top, continuing corruption, although the party has moved significantly to get rid of a lot of it, censorship issues. Will your book ever be available to Chinese readers? It may have conspired to limit the Confucian experiment, to limit it. Today, the party just isn't ready to embrace Confucius fully. A more humane political meritocracy governing a communist party state with an injection of Confucian values, emphasizing Chineseness and nationalism, remains a distant goal. Let me conclude. It's a long conclusion. With several thoughts about political meritocracy, Canada and China. First, it depends upon the Communist Party. You made it clear that the party's best members will be the standard bearers of Chinese meritocracy. They just need to add a bit of Confucianism into the mix of merit and governance. You say they have the best values for serving the people, and they will work hard to accomplish that goal. As someone who has spent 25 years training Chinese party officials here and in China and lecturing in PRC party schools, I can agree that I've met some remarkable party members over the years in China. So that's an important statement. But what about non-party people? What about the non-party people who may also have merit? Will they be able to join the future Chinese political meritocracy? Or is membership only reserved for those in the party who have acquired a good dose of Confucian values? You don't make this clear in your book. Second, aside from an elite selected on the basis of merit, you advocate for a strong state, a symbolic leader like a king, and an eventual transition from what you call lower communism to higher communism. Each of these are controversial. Having a strong state provides stability and a legal framework to regulate mass behavior. But you do acknowledge that the PRC is prone to abuse of power by its present Leninist state with legalist rather than Confucian outcomes. From my Western perspective, strong states are authoritarian, and a small group, an unelected meritocracy, even if it is humane, will also be authoritarian. And I know you talk in your book about authoritarian is a bad word that we use to counterpose between authoritarianism in the bad countries and democracy in the good countries. And we can always discuss that. We can debate that. A symbolic leader perched on top, above politics, like Canada's King Charles III, who has a constitutional presence without any power, can stabilize the political system, providing essential continuity. Finding such a person in China, in this case among the descendants of 76 generations of Kunzi, may be a wish dream. You're not the first and will not be the last to wish for a person or institution like that when searching for the best political system. And good constitutional monarchs are hard to come by or to keep in today's world. It's not just a Chinese problem. You seem to be saying that political meritocracy works best when you reach higher communism, what Marx and others have called, the phrase is, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, not to each according to his work. That's lower communism. When there is enough for all and no individual competition for resources, it's not necessary. You don't have to regulate all that activity. Of course, Marx has also said the state would then wither away. And there would be no further need for government, just the administration of things. Yet, interestingly, you write that the communist state will not disappear. Even then, for example, let's stop dreaming that Chinese bureaucrats will eventually decide to make themselves superfluous. How far will the party go to embrace Confucianism? It has taken 50 years at least to reverse its chilling verdict on Kunzi. Who can forget the Cultural Revolution? The devastating Huilin Prize campaigns, the destruction of precious books and links to China's past, with Confucian scholars beaten, sent to the countryside, and or killed. Let's see if this current party experiment has legs, that it is here to stay, although in a carefully controlled setting, as you point out just now, Confucianism as a supplement. That will be interesting. Finally, any good writer, any person with a strong argument exaggerates, and sometimes even goes further. Today, we live in a world of alternative facts. Alternate facts. I found your references to the Western demonization, which you meant at the beginning, of China, somewhat misleading. Yes, here you are in Canada. Many Canadians do have an unfavorable view of China based on our reaction to policies initiated by China, not initiated by Canada, since the early 2000s. Wolf warrior diplomacy, cyber espionage, hostage taking, meddling in our elections and in our ethnic Chinese community. When we criticize the PRC, I don't think we are demonizing Beijing, but expressing Canadian wariness, maybe even anger at Beijing's recent aggressive actions towards Canada. And many other Western countries have recently had the same experience with China. Yes, there are more than a few Americans, China's principal target, who have a more critical reaction to China's actions than we Canadians. In fact, your counterpart to China is always the United States, and so is Beijing's. It's the two playing against each other. You argue that the United States is trying to contain China's rise. That may be so. I think we can see that in the big game of international relations played out by contending nation states. But is that demonization, or is it the language of strategic competition? Somewhat different. And as a footnote to this discussion, where did the term demonization actually come from? China has been calling foreigners Yangguizi, foreign devils or demons, for several centuries. So it may be something that exists not just here, but also there. I said at the outset that your book can serve as a principal text for a course that focuses on China, to offer a counterpoint to Western views, somewhat maybe overly critical of Beijing, to think about the limitations of electoral democracy and maybe how we can strengthen this in the West, to humanize the Communist Party with Confucian value, to focus on socialism with Chinese characteristics. That is finding a Chinese way to build a modern, non-Western political system. And of course, to provide us, which you have, with a fascinating personal glimpse of a slice of Chinese politics. And for that, we can all thank you.
So, Bruce, please.
I feel very honored and quite unworthy to be a second commentator. I'm not going to read the text. I'm just going to ask a few questions and also just say what a pleasure it has been for me to read the book, to respond to it. I took it in pieces, different chapters at different times. I found myself stimulated and all kinds of new ideas and questions. So I'm going to keep this very, very brief. But just a few points that jumped out at me. We can be so critical of censorship, and I certainly have been in the Chinese context, and I'm seeing it playing out. But when we recognize how our own news media suddenly take a shift and no longer want to know anything about the good experiences that Daniel has had in China, they shut up New York Times, Global Mail, no, we don't want to know anymore, because the whole country has shifted to a kind of new perspective. That's very sobering. It's easy for us to be critical of the kinds of censorship we see in that context, but how critical are we of what we see going on in our own country and how we're kept from really interesting and enlightening insights by the fact that suddenly I saw that in your book, the New York Times reporters don't want to talk to anymore. Right? So that was the point that jumped out at me. I'm just going to pick out a few points. This one, I really appreciate all the insights into Confucianism, a Canadian being able to teach Confucianism in China, write books about it. It really fascinated me. But then I began to think, what about the other side? And to me, the great richness of my experience with China has been the balance between Confucianism, both state Confucianism and that of the people, and Taoism, and how they're really pretty opposite. So you can be a rigorous Confucian scholar up here, and then you can go into the wilderness and live as a monk for quite a few years. What's enjoyed about that was something I don't find in our Western rationality, and that is you never have to resolve that contradiction. You can be both. And I think that last little piece where you talked about Kurai and this sort of, lightness. Yes, there's all the important officials up there, and then there's the rest of us, down here talking in a very light vein and joking and so on. And to me, that was, a really great strength of Chinese culture. I call it the dialectic without synthesis. We don't need the synthesis. We can be both a fairly official Confucian type with all the levels and so on that go with it, and also be a Taoist and just, lived according to nature and so on. And I guess it would be nice to bring a bit more of that side, the Buddhist and Taoist piece. That would just be a common thing, because I found that's unusual. And it's also it creates a certain kind of freedom. I was to give you one little example from my own experience when I was a diplomat. I was in Beijing at a time when Canadians government was not talking to China and nobody came. So I was riding around the country just doing people-to-people things with movies and artists and so on. And I was very proud of the Canadian government's position, which is we don't talk to the political leaders. We're not going to do much on the economic side. But the students, the artists, the writers are the victims of Tiananmen. So we're going to expand our cultural programs. I was thinking, bring 50 or 60 Chinese scholars to Canada over those 2 years, and Canadians coming to China. Of course, the Americans couldn't because of Van being on Tiananmen Square. The French took an opposite position. Anything to do with culture, we keep all the Chinese in France and we cut all cultural programs to express our disagreement with what had happened in Tiananmen Square. So it's probably rather trying to talk to us and said, well, who do you think's right? The French or the Canadians? You know, these are two opposite policies. How do we deal with a situation like this? I love their answer. You are both right. There's no need to resolve that contradiction. We're really glad the French took a strong stand to make our leaders uncomfortable. But we're so thankful the Canadians said we're going to keep the door open. And we could be both right at the same time. And you don't have to resolve it. It's an unresolved contradiction. That's one of the kind of depth. And I see that a lot the way you're writing. But you might bring that out a little bit more between the Kura and the important officials there. You know, you can see that kind of balance. And I really appreciated that. I guess the only third thing that I want to say, because it's something that it troubles me a lot. So on the one hand, we have China saying, yes, we have to bring our ideas to the world. We have to protect our people from westernization. And then we have all the presidents of the universities saying, you got to go up in the global ranking. Well, what's the global ranking? It is the Global Research University. Where did it come from? Germany and America. There's no normal university there. The presidents of the normal universities, which are truly Confucian in their values and ideas, they're going and begging the government, take this title away. When we go to an English-speaking conference, nobody knows what a normal university is. We don't want to be. Explain Confucianism to the world in the Shandong. Teacher as a model. Which other country in the world can do that? No Western country. Education is always the lowest faculty in any Western university, and that's a European tradition. How do you tell the world about an educational university where education is a leading field as an interdisciplinary, not European disciplines chopped up, but an integrated philosophy, history, anthropology, all connected together for understanding? The Chinese are so slow about doing that. Why is the government distributing money on a Western model rather than supporting those institutions that really can embody China's Confucian values and ideas to go out and tell the world and explain? They can cooperate with the French. The French still have the École Normale Supérieure. The rest of us forgot about it. Lots of Westerners don't even know what it is. They think it means it's not abnormal. That's one of the things I find most disgusting. So I'm just waiting for China to really support its leaders, its scholars, so on to get out and explain the richness of Chinese culture. And I think, Daniel, you're really doing that, but I think, there's more elements where you can kind of encourage and make that possible, through your leadership. And I think Hong Kong's in a very good position to do that kind of thing. So those are my few points. I want to leave lots of time for everybody. I know there's going to be lots of discussion. So thank you. A great experience reading the book. I was really glad to be invited to do so. Thanks very much, everyone.
So we have about 25 minutes for interactions. So now I'm going to open the floor up. I'm going to pick up one question from the in-person audience, then another from the online audience. Since we probably have more online audience, I look here close to 30 people online, and some already entered questions. So I'm going to start from the online question, just one by one. So here is quite straightforward. What's the major difference between Chinese bureaucrat and US politician? Maybe you can include Canadian politician as well. So I think the questions for both all the speaker and the discussants. Whoever wants to respond to that.
Thank you. So they'll receive great comments. Should I?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. So, Dr. Bear, you want to provide your response to this comments? Yeah, go ahead.
It's not so much response to the comment, just adding very briefly, I don't mean to
reject electoral democracy for the whole world. I mean, I maybe in my that kind of model a little bit that's not, but I clarified later. I mean, what is an appropriate political system depends on a country's history, political culture, national conditions, size. So, I mean, a huge country like China, I argue that a model where there's more political meritocracy at the top and more democracy at the bottom might work better. But a country like Canada, that's much smaller, that has a long history of electoral democracy, I certainly do not mean to suggest that it can and should be replaced by the Chinese-style political meritocracy, just as the Chinese-style political meritocracy should be replaced by Canadian-style electoral democracy. There are certain universal values, like don't kill innocent people, the torture is bad, slavery is bad, genocide is bad. But when it comes to what's the right way of selecting political leaders, then I do think we need to allow variation based on history and culture and style and so on. So I certainly didn't mean to imply, nor am I rejecting democracy in a Chinese context. I just argue that political participation by the people works much better at local levels rather than at higher levels. And so that's my position. So I won't really. I mean, the reason why I don't like this authoritarian versus democracy distinction is because you're comparing a kind of ideal democracy with authoritarian is a highly imperfect reality, right? But we should compare ideals with ideals and highly imperfect realities with highly imperfect realities. So, I mean, nobody in China says, yes, we are proud authoritarians. That's the ideals that inspire us. No, we should. Democracy in the US, for example, some of my Chinese friends might say, well, is it really democracy? It's more like $1 one vote and one person one vote. It's more like a democracy. I mean, that's true as a highly imperfect ideal, but still, the ideal that inspires people, that's used to evaluate the critical reality, is democracy. So we compare democracy, with democratic political meritocracy in China, if you want that, or we compare highly imperfect realities, like oligarchy form of government, like in the US, with autocratic legalism in China. But like that, I just mean that's my point. Authoritarianism is just so broad, it includes so many things that, as a descriptive category, it's not very helpful, right? I mean, you have the family-run dictatorships in North Korea and military regimes, in Egypt, and you have some sort of political meritocracy with kind of legalistic characteristics in China. So I mean, I just think we need more, language that's compares what should be compared, and also in a more nuanced way captures reality. That's fine. About censorship, I mean, I agree that it is quite peculiar that the longer I've stayed in China, the less interest there is in the Western media. The global south, still, like people from global south often contact me, but when I was first in China, the CBC would come and do interviews, who's this cute little Confucian guy at Qingdao, following. So now it's like, never. I'm like, once you're labeled as an apologist, that's it. So it's like, the more I know about China, the less interest there is in social media, just from my own experience. It's not bitterness, I just feel that there's something strange going on here, About Taoism, it's not just me. I mean, it is the larger trends, and I'm just a humble footnote in this whole story. And by demonization, I just mean that, of course, we know there's a bad stuff about China. We all know that, but that's only part of the story. And any kind of more balanced account of China will also provide some parts about what works and what makes China so charming and humorous and humane, and that's all I'm learning to counter it. I'm not denying that there's a lot of bad stuff going on, right? So that's why I don't like the label apologist either. I mean, that's just, the very fact that the book is saying it's not officially endorsed suggests I'm not an apologist, right? I think 2002, and one of the reviews in the LA Review book said that I've left Confucianism, I'm more in my Taoist phase now, right? I tried to serve as public official, didn't work, now it's time to go on the mountain. But I don't write poetry well, so I'm not sure that would be an option. As far as Buddhism, I mean, I agree there's a lot more to say, but I just don't believe in nothingness. I mean, the metaphysics of Buddhism, I just don't understand. But that's not to say that I might not be the right person. Of course, I agree it's hugely important tradition. And I love what you say about normal universities. Completely agree with that. Of course, there's also the voice which are interdisciplinary
and meant to draw on this kind of more interdisciplinary Confucian and other traditions, and not be bound by the Western distinctions between different disciplines. So I agree. Normal universities, and also, no, finally the question. There is no question, sir.
Let me. Sorry for interrupting. I need to rephrase the question a little bit. Also, I need to acknowledge who asked the question. So this question is from Lisa, and I don't know he or she, and asked the second question. So I will combine the two questions into one. So just now, the first part of the question is what is the major difference between the Chinese bureaucrat and the U.S. politician? As I mentioned, you could include the Chinese politician as well. Also, Canadian politician as well. The second part of the question is the complexity of the world issue too much for any government system to deal with? I guess this question altogether might be too big for the scholars, but given you have some unique experience and background, Daniel, you served as the administrator or small bureaucrat, as you mentioned, across cultures, and both Bernie and Ruth, you served as diplomats. Maybe you can offer some insights.
Okay, well, I just very quickly, I mean, so the Chinese political system,
both in Imperial China and now, there's no clear distinction between civil servant and politician, right? You're chosen in theory. You're selected. You go through examinations, meritocratic examinations, and then selected and promoted based on performance at lower levels of government, and then you rise to the top. And there's no clear distinction. I mean, maybe at higher levels of government, there's more policy making. At lower levels of government, there's more implementation. But in principle, there's no distinction. Everybody is supposed to be meritocratically selected and promoted. But in the West, and here China, the West learned from China in the 19th century, right? In the civil service in the UK, originally you served in civil service because of your aristocratic heritage. But then, as a direct learning from the Chinese kind of imperial examination system, let's use examinations to make it more meritocratic. But there's still a distinction in principle in UK, Canada, and US between a civil servant who can be meritocratically selected. They're supposed to implement the decisions of elected politicians. So there's a clear distinction in principle between the meritocratically selected civil servant, which is closest to the Chinese public official, and the democratically elected politician. Of course, in practice, they're often mixed up, right? Like we know that ratio, yes, minister, yes, prime minister, where politicians are manipulated by the bureaucrats, where they think more long term and know how the system actually works. But in principle, there's that distinction. But in China, there's not that distinction, right? So that's the key difference. So to the extent of similarities, it's with these civil servants who are meritocratically selected in US, Canada, and UK, but not with the politicians who have a completely different agenda, right? And for them, it's to get elected the complexity, I mean, this is more of a Taoist point too, that the world is so complex that you can never get a good grasp of it. And you should at least be aware that anything you say is tied to your own perspective at a certain extent. And once you have that knowledge, at least you have superior knowledge and those who think that they could grasp a full reality. And I agree with that point. But nonetheless, you still need to make decisions in a complex world. And ideally, you would have a political decision maker who has, again, above average analytical ability, above average EQ, superior virtue, and higher capacity to work. So I'm not going to. But I mean, that's kind of what.
So, do you have anything to add?
I just think that in the Chinese political system, I don't have too much to say on this. You said if a bureaucratic position becomes politically important, it's staffed by the party. So you have this intersection of political and civil service at a upper level in the system, or in a lower level where a key post has to be served. But just like at your university, where if you consider some of the people there acting like bureaucrats, nevertheless, the party people come in when the decisions are elevated to a higher level, and they are the caretakers, people of harmony, as you put it, who are there to smooth over the decision-making and give the authoritative, to make the authoritative statement. This is what. So in China, that's somewhat different. We have that. Do we have that here? Does the Liberal Party in power tell our civil servants what to do? Maybe slightly, but not much. There's always this constant debate and argument to make sure that the political people are separate from bureaucrats. Doesn't always work. Yeah, so I think that would be my only comment. I don't know.
I don't really have much to say. I have much political science background.
Yeah, well, these are big issues that affected political scientists for years, this issue.
Do you want to respond to this question?
Well, I guess the only thing I could say is I found it very interesting working as a civil servant briefly as a diplomat. The difference between the kind of things you have to deal with and how you do so, and as an academic. So as an academic, a few weeks reading philosophy and really reflecting. As a diplomat, you have to have an answer tomorrow. And I found that very, very interesting and different to see what it was, that kind of a calling, and I suppose it's really a civil servant, not a politician. In the embassy at difficult times.
Can I just say one more thing about communist systems have a very important function. They have what's called the nomenclatura, the list of persons that they appoint, and that determines in many ways where the party intervenes into the political system, into the bureaucracy. Is this close? He's not a bureaucrat. He's been appointed by the party. These are the people in this room who are appointed by the party. These are the people who are not. That differentiates the importance of the bureaucratic function. As long as the two can exist simultaneously and the non-party appointees are satisfied with what the party appointees tell them to do, fine. If it can break down, that might be a problem. I don't see it breaking down. It's quite extraordinary because why? The bureaucratic tradition in China goes back how many thousand years? And secondly, party organization is so sophisticated and so disciplined and at such a high level that, you've seen how these people work. I mean, it's fantastic. That they're not going to make a mistake. Even in my time as a student of the Soviet Union, I used to see, even in the Soviet Union, misplaced as things were happening in the decline of Soviet communism, nomenclatura was still the way you limited the bureaucracy or you infused it and made it work. Same thing. Sorry.
Great. So I'm going to give this to the audience here.
I was wondering, I didn't read closely or struck by kind of one observation. Nobody got fired in class. And just made me reflect. I served twice as a chair of the department at the University of Toronto. And it occurred to me, sort of reading your book, that you have described, it's academia with Chinese characters. And I wonder if the Chinese had come to the University of Toronto and appointed a dean, whether, what they would write. And I would think they'd make many of the same observations, one would be, and I think you mentioned it fairly explicitly, at virtually every level below the provost, you're powerless, but you have infinite responsibilities. And the only way to work effectively is through consensual decision making in endless meetings, So, in a way, you could, much of what you say could apply to, maybe not to York University where you guys fight a lot. But that's my impression. But to almost any major sort of comprehensive university, the pattern of decision making would be quite close to what you described. I'm just wondering what your reaction is.
I don't know enough about how things work here, so I've never actually worked in a Canadian university. So, but I do. It would be great if the Chinese could write a book about surfing in Canada.
Yeah. So, we'll pick up another question online from the online audience. Another question, I guess, is more specific for Dr. Pei. The question goes as, what advice would you give to North America trained young scholars who are going to teach at Shandong University? This one doesn't identify himself or herself. So obviously, this is someone going there. So, what's your advice?
Frankly, the most important thing is to speak Chinese. I mean, Shandong is not like even Shanghai or Beijing or not to mention Hong Kong, but if you don't speak Chinese, you really encounter so many difficulties, not just because you don't understand, you don't know what people are thinking, and so the most important thing I would say, and it's quite remote. I mean, I do confess, it's a tiny village called Aoshanwei, and now in north of Qingdao. Very beautiful on the sea, so that I would say. But beyond that, if they're a productive academic, I mean, they could flourish, I think. Yeah. And it helps if they have a good drinking ability as well.
I want to add, yeah, please.
Say one quick one. I have a lot of experience advising people going to teach in China, like remembering my own. And here's my first rule. Say nothing for 6 months. This is almost impossible for a Canadian or a Westerner. Always want to fix everything. How come you're doing this wrong? How do you solve this wrong? Just listen and watch. And after 6 months, it'll all make sense. And then they will accept what you have to say and you'll be integrated. If you start immediately by solving problems, it will work. Whether we're glad you're doing it. I saw Americans coming in when I was a young scholar at Qingdao. And the second day, we would be saying, how come you're parking here? You're going to do this, that way. You don't know how to solve problems. And it just turned everybody off. And we don't teach our young people to listen. We only teach them to talk and solve problems.
Great. Do we have another question from the audience here? Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is for Professor Bell. You mentioned the Chinese political future will be shaped by communism and Confucianism. So my question is, for Marxism, communism, and Confucianism, do all of them target on the whole Chinese populations, or they target on different groups in China?
That's a good question. Well, so I think obviously the official value system, if it's Marxist, then it's meant to apply to the whole population. But it's so vague and inclusive. I mean, if you think of the core socialist values that are plastered all over China, it's 12 core socialist values. Some of them are not that many are clearly Marxist, but some are more clearly liberal, like Ziyou and Qingdao, like freedom and equality. And others are more, some of them are legalist, like Fuqian, make the country strong and wealthy. Others are more Confucian, like He. So the official kind of value system that is meant to apply to the whole country is very broad and inclusive. And the part of the communist ideal that ideally advanced machinery, well, two is, one is reducing gap to rich and poor. That refers to the whole country, right? I mean, it's the rural parts of China and the minority regions that are very poor. So there's a strong effort to make them wealthier. And the long-term aim of using advanced machinery to do socially necessary work, I mean, that would be good. The only thing is that in the Marxist tradition, it doesn't say that creative work necessarily involves working with your brain. I mean, it also involves working with your hands, right? For Karl Marx, he wrote hardly anything about higher communism, but the form of education it would include working with your hands and working with your mind. So which could be creative as well, working manual labor.
can be done. Like just think of cooking, right? I mean, that's the most beautiful example. I think of what people are doing in higher communism, not like fishing or hunting, or I mean, I don't know why he used those examples. Cooking is a much better example where you have a it's Marx in the German. Oh, but I mean, that was English contribution. Okay. So, cooking is a beautiful example where you have an idea of what to make, and then you use your hands to make it, and then you create something beautiful and creative. That's sort of
the Marxist ideal, which I think is meant to apply to the whole country.
Morning fishing, right.
That part is more
Strange that he would use those kind of pre-technological
IT examples. Anyway, but the Confucian, it's widely misused or
misunderstood as a kind of Chinese thing. It's not, right? I mean, it's a universal ethic, and it influenced Korea and Vietnam and Japan and other countries as well. So it's meant to be a universal ethos, and it's not meant to be an exclusive identity. You could be, both a Confucian and a Muslim, for example. Like I went to Chufu with one of my Germer. His name is he's the son of Confucius too. His name is Kong Xingfang. And your own article about the spirit of Chufu. We went to the Muslim part of Chufu and we interviewed some. And I said, yes, we're committed Muslims, but we also value education and feel piety. So we think the Confucian ideal is not meant to be exclusively Han Chinese in any way. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Professor Bell, my question is concerned with this topic. Yeah, so it's a pity I have not read your book. As you mentioned, Confucianism and communism are the very important factors to bureaucratic surroundings or atmosphere in China. Yeah, so do you think in what way they are combined with each other? Yes, this is my first question. Yeah, the second question is, before being a dean in Shandong University, you had worked in Qingdao University for more than 10 years. Yeah, so have you found there any obvious difference between Shandong University and Qingdao University in bureaucratic surroundings or atmosphere? Yeah, so these are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, so about communism and Confucianism, I mean, there's no harmonious resolution because ultimately they're different in terms of what the ideals are. For Confucianism is very diverse, but still, the good life lies in compassionate and harmonious social relations, starting with the family, which you then extend outside the family. So it's through social relations, through kind of whether it's with family or with friends or others. That's the good life. Whereas for communists, it's through realizing your creative essence, through creative work. And they go in different directions. Actually, I gave a talk in Shanghai like a month ago, and then a young woman came up to me and says, "That's not like the future 30 years. No, I experience this tension now. I want to develop my creative talents through my career, but I also have a family, and they often conflict in practice. So it's not. I mean, this will be like sort of an example where there's going to be contradiction, but without a synthesis or not. It's very dialectic. Yeah. I mean, there won't be. I think there won't be there. Another thing is that they also have different views regarding manual labor. Confucianism, and this is a problem with Confucianism, tends to look down on manual labor, right? I mean, Mengzi, Mencius, he famously said, those who work with their minds should rule over those who work with their hands. That's so strange. Whereas the Marxists value both manual and creative labor. So with mind, so that's another difference. And in that sense, I hope the Marxists will, prove to persuade the Confucians that manual labor is also hugely important if it's done in a creative way. Not if it's done in a factory turning a screw. I mean, that's mind-blowing to anyone, right? But creative manual labors, I'm not very good in my hand, but so I'm told it can be creative as well. About Qinghua, that's one thing. Yeah. So in Qinghua, I never served in the administration, so I don't have that part of it. But I know the meetings in philosophy were much more, didn't take long, and it was like less than 1 hour. Typically the head, and I was also dean, would just give a few, little speeches, and then everybody would say one or two things, and it would end very quickly. And then people would pay their fees to, for the party, and then that's it. Whereas at Shandong, it's much more bureaucratic. I mean, the meetings would really last, as mentioned, like 4 hours. Everybody talks for 15 minutes and take their responsibilities I don't want to say in a more serious way, but maybe in a more serious way. But Tsinghua has changed a lot since I left, so I really don't. And also students are different in the sense that, as you know, to get into Tsinghua, you have to do well in the English part of the Gaokao. So the students at Shandong, they're just as good on everything except English. So the key difference with students is that in terms of ability, I'd say that more or less the same, but the English level typically is higher at Tsinghua than at Shandong. That would be. Also at Tsinghua, they get more opportunities. That's another thing, They get more opportunities to go abroad and get more resources to do what they want. So that's another thing, is that big provincial universities like Shandong have great students but they don't have as many opportunities to develop as the ones at Tsinghua. Yeah.
Okay, we actually gone over time, but we still have two interesting questions online. So I'm going to focus on those two questions. I'll pick up the more straight one for Dr. Bale, so you can start answer that briefly. The question for you is, as the dean and a non-communist, were you able to attend the party members' meeting, especially at a high level for decision-making, such as appointment of positions? Do you think you were treated the same as other Chinese deans? Most were communist members in the university with respect to your authority in making decisions.
Well, it depends on what. I mean, when it comes to appointing people, we had we had an academic committee where each person had a vote, and I don't think actually I don't think that the party secretary was even part of it. So it didn't make a difference at that level. There's one or two examples where somebody was vetoed for political reasons, and that was done by the party secretary. But it really depends how well they get along, and I think we got along pretty well. So there wasn't that tension. I mean, there was one meeting where it was professors. It was a conference on scholars from China who work on India. Normally, I would give the opening speech, but that one, people said, "Well, maybe you're not, appropriate for that." But that happened very rarely. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
In your time in Shandong or elsewhere, when you're dealing with party people, were you ever permitted to join in on a party meeting where the party people talk about what they're doing? Because I have never been able to do that. In Russia, all the years that I was there, when I remember in the law faculty, as soon as we were all together talking about whatever we were doing, they said, "Okay, now it's time for the party meeting. Non-party people leave." So you never knew what the party people were doing in China. The same thing. I was training all these party people. As soon as they had to have a party meeting, I had to leave the room. So I'm just curious, were you ever able to get into a party meeting? That would be an unusual achievement. I would be very excited to hear that.
We didn't have, we had these 4 meetings with party secretaries.
It's not an official party meeting, like only party people.
Well, obviously, I don't know. Probably those took place, but I didn't feel like there's something going on there that's more important than we were actually doing. Towards the end of my stay, when I was like a symbolic leader, there were 3 key members of our department who really held that meeting. The things were decided before the official meeting. I wasn't part of that. It's more because it was determined that I was no longer a player, But yeah, things were pretty fluid at Shandong, but probably at other universities it works differently.
Like there's a party group at the university where you ushered into a party group meeting, or just meeting with party officials here and there.
I met with some party
That would be
officials.
exciting if you actually had into a real meeting and they you could tell us what they really talked about.
how they make policy.
So I think that's what we make policy in this meeting.
Okay, yeah.
That's where it was made.
Well, that's
It wasn't a separate kind of meeting as far as I know, but more important decisions were. Yeah.
Well, you got close, really.
But maybe it's probably things like, would be different.
Okay, the very last question. So then we close up. This is a quite complicated question, so I'll try to summarize. And this question is from Alex Makos. He talked about the changing conditions in China in terms of the economic downturn, the capital market, the real estate market. So I won't repeat. This is a very long question. I guess maybe 500 words. So I'm going to jump right into the three parts of the questions. The first part is, have you seen these changes in economic and market conditions affecting the growth and development of existing post-secondary institutions with international partnerships, or a reduction in new joint ventures with foreign institutions in the post-secondary education? The second part of the question is, do you see these changing circumstances impacting internationalization in China's post-secondary landscape? And last part is the desire for internationalization still strong or mutual where funding conditions allow? Or are political or other circumstances negatively affecting the interest? So those are questions I have.
I think
Three.
I think a great question. And for you,
You got space, bunch of you and Bruce. So why don't you?
Go ahead, Bruce, go ahead. You go ahead.
Why don't you haven't taken the first better answer. It's for you.
Not very close to it. I think that was a lot.
Actually, I don't have a definite answer. I think it's a premature to provide very clear answer to such a question. We still have to wait and see. Definitely, those changing conditions affecting the internationalization because I'm personally following the media coverage. For instance, we have less Chinese students going abroad. Especially yesterday, I read something and the Wang Pei news network. It's a clear or even dramatic reduction of the Chinese students going to the US. And my friends who is doing such a research in Peking University, he told me, well, in Tsinghua and in Peking University used to be typically 40%, close to 40% of the graduates went abroad, mostly to the US. And now it's around 7%. So you can say it's a dramatic reduction. So clearly things are changing, but Chinese economy is also recovering, and I mean things are further changing. So we have to wait and see. So it's now too early to make any conclusion.
I guess.
I just want to add one point. I am very thankful that the China Scholarship Council is funding large numbers of visiting doctoral students and visiting. I have 5 that have just come in the last little while. And I keep thinking, are they ever going to shut that down? And I know others. I think we have scholars here who have come over. So whatever they may be saying about westernization, they are funding people to go for a year where they can be totally exposed, use the library, attend conferences, join seminars. That is positive. I just hope it continues.
We went over time by 11 minutes. I guess we have to close up. Thank you so much for coming to this event or joining us online. And let's give a big hand to the speaker and the discussants.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah. Very nice.
Thank you.